Agent Smith World Discussion. I'll be your host, Neuro Starcrap. Let's kick some ass. Alright. What's up, dude?
Hello?
Hey. Welcome.
Hey, how are you?
Kick ass. How are you?
Can't complain.
Well,
Full of chicken 65 tonight.
Chicken 65? What is that?
That's an Indian dish from, that originated, I think, in southern India, Hyderabad. It's good stuff. Basically just sort of cheap, spicy chicken.
Alright, well, you have to share it with the rest of the class now. That's good. For people who don't have the history and the lore, we would go out to Indian places pretty often with Kukio. Indian restaurants, I feel, have a really awesome variety of flavors and spices and stuff, with a lot of the familiar meats of just like chicken, lamb, whatever, that are in Western restaurants. It can be intimidating, but I think if you can dive into it, it's really, really awesome.
Yeah.
But that's cool. So we've had a good stream so far. I'm actually at a new high for my rank for the past several months. I'm 62, so that's always kind of refreshing if I can figure out what's going on and move up the ladder, and I can post better results and show better games and whatnot. The key things that have helped me to do that this time are having a better warm-up procedure at the start of my day. So I've been doing about a 1.5 mile run before I get started, which really helps me connect with my body because you have the speed of hand aspect to kicking ass at StarCraft.
Yeah.
And then also muting my microphone for try-hard practice. If I'm talking, I'm always playing slower. I'm kind of playing and I'm talking at the same time, which means I'm describing what just happened, as opposed to if I mute myself, I'm thinking about the next 2 moves, which is super important for doing everything really fast.
Yeah. Well, nice.
Yeah.
Always good to make progress.
It is. It's rather encouraging for the morale.
I'm in particular impressed with the running. I think the last time I tried to run 50 yards, I ended up collapsing on the floor and had some paramedics called on me.
Oh. Well, fortunately, we have innovated locomotives and motor vehicles, so we can get around without running. It's kind of more optional at this point.
Very beneficial to the fat people such as myself. Appreciation to you inventors out there.
Oh, nice. We just got a host from Pickle and a donation for Agent Smith. What is this? 20 bucks. Pass this along to Agent Smith. Love the focus on intellectual content. It's a breath of fresh air on Twitch.
Oh.
Very nice. Alright, so let's hit it. What happened this week? I feel like this week was a little bit less noisy than last week, just for drama and news and stuff. Because last week we had the Mueller investigation and a big shooting and stuff. It just seemed like news was everywhere. What happened this week?
Well, there was actually some pretty interesting stuff that happened this week. Most of it in the international sphere, not so much in the United States. The thing that really caught my eye was this Chinese conglomerate called Anbang. I think that's how it's pronounced anyway. And it was actually seized by the government. And that was a pretty significant event because Anbang is one of the largest conglomerates in China, and its head was a guy named Wu Xiaohui. And Mr. Wu was one of the most powerful men in China. Well, not necessarily one of the most powerful, but one of the most connected. Which, having good connections in China generally means you're almost untouchable. Mm-hmm. You know, that means you're in a strong position to exert influence in the economy and in politics. He'd actually married the daughter of Deng Xiaoping, who was the guy that led China and implemented the economic reforms that were so successful in the 1980s and since. So it was a very large, wealthy firm, and it was led by a very well-connected person. And you would not then expect that such an institution would come under attack, but that's what happened. Last year, Wu Xiaohui was arrested and charged with quote-unquote economic crimes, which is ambiguous and remains ambiguous. And this past week, the firm itself was just outright seized by the government and is going to be run, at least temporarily, by the government going forward. So it's a little unclear as to exactly why the government did that. Supposedly it's part of the sort of broader anti-corruption campaign that the party has been pushing so hard the past few years. But, you know, anti-corruption is frequently a mask for other motivations when it comes to authoritarian political systems. So who's to say just what it was? There are some theories. It might just be the government trying to continue to crack down on money leaving China. There's been a trend over the past few years of money trying to find a way out of the Chinese government's strict capital control regime. The capital control regime is just meant to make it difficult for money to come into China and make it difficult for people to move money out of China. And that's to sort of maintain China's financial system as a kind of isolated ecosystem, separated from the broader international financial system. Mm-hmm. And it's got some leaks in it, basically. And that's a problem for two reasons. One, it kind of makes it a little more difficult to manage the currency, which is not a fixed currency, or rather the currency is not forced into a fixed exchange rate, but it is what you would call a sort of a floating band. They try to keep the value of the yuan within a certain band around a fixed value. So they do allow it to float a little bit, but just not too much. They don't want dramatic swings that could potentially damage the economy. Mm. So managing a currency like that requires you can manage a currency in a couple of ways. You can do it just through interest rates, or you can do it through specifically through capital controls. And the Chinese government wants to maintain an independent monetary policy, so they prefer to do it through capital controls. So that's largely the mechanism that they do that. But so having people move money out kind of makes that more difficult. It's also feeding the shadow banking sector, which we've talked about before on here. Because the financial system in China is not very open, it's not very liberalized, it's not a very modern, healthy market. A lot of people with large amounts of savings don't have a lot they can invest their savings in. Mm-hmm. And so that's created a market for investment, basically underground investment. You know, people who might in a more open system invest in stocks or bonds or what have you, they see better returns in this underground sector where basically people of perhaps dubious trust will offer to take your money and put it to good use and give you a good rate of return, higher than what you could get in other markets. So that's created a lot of risk in the financial system because a lot of large financial institutions also participate in the shadow banking sector, such as it is. And that's creating a lot of unseen risks in the sector that the government is worried about, as well as other economic actors. So seizing Anbang might have been also an effort to try to mitigate the participation in the shadow banking sector by large firms like Anbang. Let's see. So there was also,
to connect with some of the other points we've made with China and stuff, is they have a very opaque system. So for us, you were saying it's fairly interesting this happened, but relative to how they conduct business, it might be kind of standard fare. Oh, this happens. Mm. Is it unusual for this to happen relative to the distribution of events of this type in China?
It's not necessarily unusual. Generally, economic actors and political actors have a strong overlap between them, so it's not unusual for the government to have a strong role in the private sector. Basically, if you want to succeed in the private sector, you have to know someone in government. You have to have those good connections. Mm-hmm. Generally, when people talk about good connections in China, they're generally referring to people who have connections in government, in the Communist Party of China, since those are the people who really have the decision-making power, the discretionary power to make or break a business. What's unusual is for such a large firm to be subject to this kind of arbitrary justice. Normally, if you're a smaller firm, you might be predated upon by some local officials or perhaps provincial officials who want a cut of your business, or who are demanding that they be given some role in the company in exchange for favorable oversight, favorable regulations, whatnot. But normally, the big firms that are led by people with really good connections can kind of get out of that, or they have connections such that they can prevent serious predation by lower-level officials, or even higher-level officials. But what happened here is that the party just kind of almost arbitrarily moved in and seized them without warning. It might not have been as disruptive if there had been more foresight. You know, if there had kind of been a lead up, like we're investigating these people, and then we might have to seize the firm, and then okay, we're seizing the firm. As was, there were sort of rumors. There was sort of a nominal notion that the government was looking into Anbang, but that connected more to the guy who had been the head of Anbang. That was Wu Xiaohui. The idea that the government would go full tilt seizure. That was unexpected, so that's what's unusual, and that's what made it stand out from other such incidents of the government exerting power over firms in the private sector.
Gotcha.
So it's also kind of a sign of the party's move to try to reassert control over China generally. Over the course of the reform period, the China kind of took its hands off of the society, not fully, obviously, but partly. There was more breathing space to be an entrepreneur. There was a little more breathing space politically. There was just a little bit more of an open society in China. And since Xi Jinping has come to power, one of the trends that's emerged in China is the party becoming more assertive in broad swaths of the society that they had previously kind of let slide. So there's less political openness. There's less of a market of ideas. You can't talk as openly online. You know, cracking down on online speech has been a particular priority for the party. And then there's also been a corresponding crackdown on the private sector, particularly in the financial sector, shadow banking, etc. So this could be a big signal from the party that they want to really stamp this out, and that other firms engaging in this behavior should stop, or they can expect similar treatment.
When you say shadow banking, I don't know if you played Elder Scrolls. It makes me think of a thieves guild organization. Shadow banking. We'll take your money and it will go somewhere we don't know. And it'll come back and there's more.
Well, that's exactly it. And some of them are thieves. You know, there is a recurring theme in China wherein people will give money to people in order to get good rates of return, but don't really know where it's going, and then they just have their money disappear and they can't really get it back. Because the whole thing was basically illegal. You're not really supposed to do that. So it's kind of hard to go to the police. There was another aspect to this too, which is that some people have been suggesting that the firm may have been on the verge of insolvency, partly probably because of risky shadow banking endeavors. So one of the things in the BBC article I read was that the government may have moved in to try to help stop the firm from collapsing and potentially creating waves, basically, within the Chinese economy. You know, a lot of people, including retail investors, have money invested in Anbang. And if the firm basically liquidated, if it became bankrupt, that would be a big problem. A lot of those people would lose their money. And it could have implications for not just economic stability in China, but possibly also political stability. You saw a little bit of that with the big collapse in the Shanghai Stock Exchange a few years ago. You know, nominally, the party has been trying to cultivate a stock exchange in Shanghai, but when there finally was a big dip in the market, they intervened and stopped trading and introduced a lot of very intrusive mandates, basically, to try to stabilize the market and stop the losses. And the reason they did that is because so many retail investors, basically small-time investors, just sort of regular people, had invested money in the stock market and were losing so much money. The party was afraid that there might then emerge a constituency that opposed party rule, basically. You know, one thing leads to another. People lose their money in the stock market, are furious, and blame the party. Well, the party doesn't want that, so rather than let the market work itself out, they intruded and intervened. So if it's the case that the party intervened to take control of Anbang in order to stop a similar such event, it may be that they were concerned also, here again, about stability, political and economic. So that's a possibility, but it's not something we're really sure about yet. But it also, if that's the case, would be an implication of economic weakness in China. One of the problems that's kind of been pointed out in China is very high levels of debt in the private sector, especially for state-owned enterprises. And you know, that also dovetails with a huge amount of debt held by local government in China, which is not backbreaking, but it's very large. And combined with state-owned enterprise debt, overall debt levels in China have rapidly increased over the past 10 years. And there's some suspicion, not confirmed, but suspicion, that debt may be unmanageable, and that it may be a bubble that could explode at some point and take a big chunk of the economy with it. So seizing Anbang, possibly because of it's on the verge, possibly because it might be on the verge of collapse because of debt, would feed that narrative. That would be kind of evidence of that. Again, without knowing exactly why they seized it, you can't quite make that argument. But you know, when dealing with China in a closed political system, you have to engage in a little bit of what they used to call Sovietology, which was kind of reading the tea leaves, looking at little signals here and there and trying to interpret broader meaning to them, kind of assigning broader meaning to them. And you kind of had to do that just because there was so little information to work with. The party is very insular and opaque, and so you kind of have to resort to that if you want to do analysis. So this is a possibility. It may be that this is evidence of weakness in the Chinese economy owing to debt, but don't assume that. That's just a possibility.
We have lots of examples of that in strategy games like StarCraft, where you read into partial clues that don't definitively say what's going on, but it kind of raises some alarms that something is happening here, and we could rule out certain things and we can maybe take a guess at what's going on here, but it's not totally clear exactly what's happening. And a lot of times it's worth trying to read between the lines and figure out a counter strategy before you get the full story of what's going on, just because time is short, and if you want to have a very successful plan, you need to act fast, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. You know, you just don't have anything to work with, so you take what you can get and try to sort of spin straw into gold, so to speak. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You know, we've talked before about predicting the collapse of the Soviet Union and how a lot of people didn't see that coming, how it was kind of a big surprise for the analytic community. Well, another implication from the seizure of Anbang is that it sets a bad precedent. If nothing else, it shows it's another example of the lack of rule of law in China. One of the advantages of having strong rule of law, an independent judicial system, due process, etc., is that there are not really negative shocks like this. You know, generally things happen slowly over a long period of time, and you can kind of plan accordingly. You know, if you're an economic actor and you have investments in sensitive areas of the economy, and somebody does something illegal that warrants state intervention or state attention, generally there's some kind of lawsuit or court action, and you can kind of get time to prepare. You can kind of see what's happening. But in China, it's much more difficult to do that and much rarer because the institutions are not quite as developed as they should be. China is a little bit undergoverned because of the way the Communist Party of China evolved as an institution. You know, it actually evolved a bit differently than the Soviet Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party. The Bolsheviks became bureaucratized very quickly. It was very much an administrative party. But the Communist Party of China sort of eschewed bureaucracy. In fact, one of the reasons for the Cultural Revolution, which we were talking about, I think, last week or a couple weeks ago, one of the reasons for that was specifically because Mao did not want the Communist Party of China to become more bureaucratic. He wanted the party to stay closer to its roots, closer to the people. And so he tried to mobilize the population and sort of force the party to cater to the needs and interests of the peasants and the broader population, without at the same time sacrificing its authority, which is kind of a difficult balance to strike, and he missed pretty definitively there. But that was nominally the motivation. So because that was more the direction they took to try to kind of strike a balance between remaining attached to the people and the grassroots while at the same time not giving up power, institutions in China are very decentralized, but they're also very thin. They're not really well designed. There's a lot of holes and problems that lend themselves to corruption. And when you give institutions a lot of discretionary power in a system like that, there's invariably a lot of abuses that follow. So part of what Xi Jinping has done since he's come to power is try to address that. That's been another characteristic of his regime thus far, is that he's trying to build China's institutions. He's kind of modernizing the party, the judicial system, the state, etc., introducing a lot of aspects to governance that the party and China has not had since the Communist Party of China came to power, in order to make the machinery of state and the machinery of party run more efficiently. I got off on a tangent there. I'm not sure how I got onto that.
Tangents are fun.
Anyway, this event, the seizure of Anbang, just highlights that lack of rule of law. And it's a reminder to foreign investors in particular that it's a little bit more risky to invest in China than in an equivalent state that has more rule of law. It's not extremely risky, and people will still invest there, certainly. But this just sort of serves as another reminder that that is something you have to consider when investing there, and it serves as a barrier to trade, effectively. Because China is not going to get as much investment as it would otherwise if it did have better rule of law. Another implication here was that it kind of sets a moral hazard. It creates a moral hazard, because if the firm was seized because it was on the verge of collapsing, then that kind of seizure would suggest then that the government will always kind of bail you out if you get into trouble and you're big enough. You know, if you're a firm or a local government or what have you, and you have enough debt, if you have so much debt that failure would endanger the wider economy, then don't worry about it. Beijing will come and bail you out. So that moral hazard creates a problem then as far as preventing further debt, basically preventing further local government and large corporations, specifically state-owned enterprises, from continuously borrowing and making the problem worse and worse, making it harder and harder to bail them out, and making the eventual implosion all the worse. You know, again, this is one of the reasons that certain people, critics basically, China bears, if you will, think that Chinese economy is sort of eventually going to have a debt crisis that, you know, maybe not cripples it, but does a lot of damage. And then finally, if it was done for political reasons, if this was not done because the firm was on the verge of collapse or what have you, if this was just done to get back, or rather to remove Wu Xiaohui, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, so I apologize, but if this was more of a political battle that was targeting Wu Xiaohui, then that also kind of underscores political risk in China. It just shows that it's easy as a business to get caught up in political infighting in a closed political system. That in turn represents risk as well that you have to incorporate and serves as another barrier to trade and investment. So I thought that was an interesting sort of data point. The whole Anbang event was an interesting data point as far as marking Chinese politics and sort of some interesting evidence as to what the state of the Chinese economy might be.
That's cool.
So kind of a long-winded answer to a simple question. What happened this week?
Well, the vast majority of the viewership is from the West, so I feel like China doesn't quite get the news it deserves relative to how big of a player it is in the world right now. Mm-hmm. So, long-winded, yeah, we could probably use that, thank you.
Well, no problem. It comes very naturally. Let's see, the other...
fun for me.
Sorry, what?
This kind of thing is fun for me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just like old times. Mm-hmm. Let's see, the other big thing was Netanyahu over in Israel he's kind of had this running corruption problem as far as corruption investigations, and you know, some of it is just partisan politics, but there's always kind of been a debate since these corruption allegations have been made and investigated that you know, just how legitimate are these accusations? Is it really just partisan bullshit, or are these allegations like legitimately predicated on an actual crime? And so up till now, the sentiment had been it was more of a political thing, but over the past week, there was a former aide of Netanyahu, who turned state's witness and is going to testify against him, and that's lending a lot more credence to these corruption allegations. So now, you know, the media is paying more attention, or at least the international media is paying more attention. So there are basically 3 different accusations being made. One is that he illegally gave favorable treatment to a telecoms firm. Supposedly he pushed Israeli regulators to help a firm called Bezek, I think it is. Again, terrible pronunciation, so I apologize. Supposedly he pushed regulators to help that firm in return for that firm giving favorable coverage on one of its websites, because it was a telecommunications firm, so it had media outlets. Supposedly this aide that has turned state's witness received explicit instructions from Netanyahu to help Bazik in this way. So that's one charge. Another one involves a quid pro quo with a newspaper in which he offered to rein in, quote-unquote, a rival publication in exchange for favorable coverage. And then the third accusation that's kind of gaining currency is that he received valuable, well, there's no doubt that he received valuable gifts, quote-unquote, from a Hollywood mogul named Arnon Milchan. I don't know who that is, but apparently a Hollywood mogul, as well as some of his other supporters. So the accusation is that Netanyahu responded to that gift, and that the gift may have been a quid pro quo for this, that he responded by pushing through a law that would waive taxes for Israelis who had waived taxes for 10 years for Israelis who are returning to Israel after having lived abroad. And supposedly Aaron Milchan was eligible, would be eligible for that. So that was sort of the quid pro quo, gifts in exchange for not having to pay taxes for 10 years. So again, these are all still in court, so these are still allegations, these are not convictions. So we can't really say Netanyahu definitely did these things and that these accusations are accurate representations of what happened. But they have been lent more credence by the sort of escalation in the investigation that's come with this aid turning state's witness, probably among other developments that I don't know about since I don't follow Israeli politics regularly. So that's this is something to keep an eye on, basically, because Netanyahu is very hawkish. So if Netanyahu were to be pushed out, it's a possibility, not particularly likely, but it's a possibility that someone less hawkish would assume office in Israel, and that there would in turn be repercussions as far as the peace process vis-a-vis Palestine, if not in terms of regional tensions with Israel and the conflict in Syria.
So for some people, the descriptor hawkish might not be super obvious.
Oh,
from my memory, Clinton was a more hawkish candidate than Bernie Sanders. Why, and what does that mean?
So hawkish just means that you're more forceful in foreign policy, that you're more ready to use military force. Basically, it just means you're more aggressive in general. It doesn't necessarily mean you want to use military force, just that you're more willing to, and that you're willing to be more belligerent in your foreign policy generally. More willing to kind of throw your weight around, use your influence more in your foreign policy to get what you want. The contrast, the opposite of hawkish is dovish, which is to be more peaceful, to emphasize cooperation and negotiation over confrontation. So in general, Hillary Clinton was considered the more hawkish candidate in the presidential election. In contrast, the President Barack Obama was more dovish, in contrast, which created some friction when she was his Secretary of State. There was some disagreements there, but roughly that's what it is. And I don't know how far back in American history that terminology goes. I know they used it a lot in Vietnam. The people who wanted to stay in Vietnam, and I'm referring to the Vietnam War here for anyone not familiar with it, but in the 60s, people who wanted to continue fighting the Vietnam War and keep the troops in and escalate U.S. involvement were considered hawks, and were considered hawkish. And the people who wanted to de-escalate, is that a word? De-escalate?
Yes.
People who wanted to, thank you, people who wanted to de-escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam and eventually pull the troops out, they were considered doves and more dovish in their views.
Well, I mean, people who know about birds could probably also make that inference. Now that you give the comparison of hawks versus doves, at least in terms of their symbolism and role in biology and stuff. But yeah, thank you.
Let's see. So I think, well, I can keep going, but we have some questions. Probably I should. Let's see. Is it just connections, or does the family name impact your connection, quote-unquote, in China as it does in Japan? I think it is more connections. It's not so much family name. You know, it's being born into a powerful family in China is advantageous. This is sort of what they call princelings in China, people who were born to powerful figures in the Communist Party, especially people who were involved in the original revolution back in the 1930s and 40s. But even beyond that, it's still more connections. You know, even at the lower level, because it's not something that just happens at the top level. It's not just people at the top level using their connections in order to become more powerful and exert more influence. This is something that happens throughout Chinese society. It is a trait and characteristic of Chinese political culture, if not culture generally. They call it guangxi over there. And I apologize for my bad pronunciation. I've never been able to speak Chinese well. But that is the word they use, and it's everywhere, it's everything. It's not just powerful figures in the party's upper echelon. It's all the way down into the lower levels. You know, if you want to get even something as simple as like a license, like for a drive, there's a whole bunch of licenses in China. There's a whole YouTube video about it somewhere. I don't remember who made it, but there was like over 100 different licenses that you need just to do even basic things. So if you need a license within a certain time frame, and maybe the local government responsible for giving you that license is known for dragging its feet, maybe it helps to know somebody. Probably also helps to have a bribe ready, but knowing somebody is safer than a bribe, because then they can kind of exert their influence on your behalf, and then in turn you owe them a favor that they can in turn call later. So it's not so much there is an element of family background and name. Again, that's the princelings, but that's more at the upper levels of the party. That's more national governance. The lower in the party echelon you get, and the lower the level of governance, the kind of less important it is. That's my perception anyway.
I would guess that this may have evolved some as we've moved out of monarchies and toward representative democracies, where in a monarchy the name of royals and people who are related to them carried more weight than now. It's more kind of economic, and it's more based on what you are doing and what the people you're working with are actively producing, as opposed to that kind of divine right of kings of who is blessed by the creators and who has that innate power. It's more about what you can do nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah, even China is relatively more meritocratic than the previous system, you know, under the emperor, for example. The old dynastic system is, you know, has been washed away and replaced with something that is not perfectly meritocratic, but that is relatively more so. As imperfect and laden with corruption as it may be. Let's see. There's a stigma that China is one of the worst environmental offenders, yet I've heard people like Elon Musk indicate that China is far ahead of the US in terms of environmental policy. Is this true? Why might the stigma of China being environmentally reckless be pervasive in Western societies? Well, there's a difference between it being environmental offenders or being environmentally reckless. There's a difference between that and being ahead in terms of environmental policy. So China's pollution is still very much a problem. It's apparently gotten better in Beijing, but in general, it's still very much a big deal over there. The thing is, the party is more and more trying to address that with different policies that are meant to mitigate it. For example, they implemented I don't know if you would call it a law, since the party doesn't generally do that much, but basically they've determined that they're going to replace diesel vehicles by 2030 or some such. Something to that effect. I'm not as much into the environmental policy making as other people, so somebody more familiar probably knows what the law is I'm talking about, what the policy I'm talking about is. But and I would welcome that in chat. Now's a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in a lot of the stuff we talk about. A lot of the stuff we get into is peripheral to my expertise. So I welcome feedback, criticism. You know, if I say something stupid, I want to know more than anybody. So I encourage people to participate in chat as far as that. So the Chinese government has that policy, as well as a whole slew of other sort of environmental regulations, new policies that they're passing. So in that sense, in terms of actually taking action and trying to do something, they've enacted more far-reaching and sweeping environmental policies than a lot of Western countries have, like say the United States. But that said, there is still a pollution problem. The policies that the government has passed are going to take a while to take effect, and they could reverse them at any time, depending on the fallout. If there is If they start causing a lot of economic problems, for example, they might have to stop them temporarily. That happened, I think, this past winter. They've been trying to shift away from coal, and I don't exactly remember the story, so I'm probably going to get some of the details wrong, but basically the way they implemented the policy resulted in people not having heating in the dead of winter, which is a problem in the north of China because it can get real cold up there. And so they had to kind of undo this policy change because of that problem. And they were very quick to do that once it became apparent that people were freezing in their houses. I don't think that means they're going to permanently abandon that policy, which again I think was meant to move away from coal as an energy source. But over the short term they did, because it was necessitated, and the party is not above doing that over the long term as well, depending on circumstances. So I think partly the reputation of China in the West as being an environmental offender, so to speak, stems from the fact that its pollution is still very bad and has been bad for a long time. In fact, the fact that it's been bad over a long period of time is probably more important than how it is now. Generally, reputations change after what they're based on changes. There's kind of a lag effect. You know, if you have a reputation for something but you stop doing that thing, it's going to take a while for your reputation to catch up with you, so to speak. And there's kind of a similar phenomena with China, or there will be anyway, once China's pollution problem starts to mitigate and becomes less of an issue. But for now, it's not entirely undeserved, this notion that China has a problem with pollution. It really does, and the government is trying to act on it, and it's because it's acting on it that it's taken a lot of these initiatives, policy initiatives, that have so enamored people who are interested in environmental policy making.
One of the themes that we can kind of contrast with other countries in the West, like the US, is the population size, but also the unity of China, where sometimes they'll kind of lag behind for a change, and they're behind some smaller countries, but then when they commit to it, they do it across the board, and it's just a huge, really big, fast change. So they tend to kind of click into the phases in a more abrupt way than a lot of other countries will, and it tends to be maybe on average behind the curve because they have 1 billion people. So governing 1 billion people is very different from governing 300 million or whatever we have in the US. And I think we forget about that a lot of the time. We think of countries as a single unit of China is a country, India is a country, the US is a country, but the volume of the people in the country and also the geography, like you're saying here with the north of China, and how they have different problems that you don't have in other parts of China, means that it's a lot bigger of a problem to solve to govern that many people.
Exactly. Yeah, that's very accurate, and that's a very good point. You know, Europe doesn't have 1 billion people. I think it's something like 600 million people in Europe, and they can't agree on shit. You know? So China may not have as much ethnic diversity as Europe does, but you know, the fact remains that there's an immense amount of diversity in economic and political interests, owing to the large size of the country and the large geographic size of the country. And managing all of that is immensely difficult. You know, one of the previous premiers of China was a guy named Hu Jintao. And, you know, again, apologize for pronunciation. But he was premier, I think, from roughly the late 90s up until Xi Jinping, basically, up until 2010 or so, something around there. And Hu Jintao's regime was known for its, basically, inactivity, its inability to make change in order to push reform, in order to really take any kind of significant initiative. And so his period of rule was known very much for political stagnation. It was also known for economic growth. Obviously, China grew quite a bit between, you know, roughly 2000 and 2010. But politically, the government was just hamstrung, and partly that came down to a multitude of competing interest groups within the party system. And that's a function of just having a huge population. You can see a similar dynamic in India. It's more transparent in India because it's a democracy, so you can really see all of the different political interests competing with each other much more openly there. And it's just a big mess. It's very hard to do anything at the national level on account of that. India gets around that a little bit by giving a lot more power to its states. China actually gives a surprising amount of discretionary power to its provinces too. But it's still very much an authoritarian top-down system. It's very much a hierarchy of power, with the top being in control. In India, it's more the other way around, where states and localities have a lot more impact. on decision making, and that alleviates some of the difficulty of governing a billion people, because you don't generally have to govern a billion people. You have multiple polities governing perhaps 20 million people, 50 million people, etc., thereby making the whole project more manageable. But yeah, the point is well taken. It's governance is immensely, exponentially more difficult the more people you have involved.
That Paul Ryan quote was so funny when he was saying, yeah, well, we may not have passed the healthcare bill, but it's hard going from an opposition party to a governing party. Governing is tough. That's true.
Yeah. Yeah. He's right. That's something you can see in any new government that takes power. It's funny this topic comes up. I've been doing a lot of research about Latin America and Latin American politics as part of a new podcast I'm working on. I'm going to try to get it out by the end of the month, but I bit off more than I can chew, like I usually do, so it's been a bit of a burden. But one of the interesting stories that I came across was from, I think it was Bolivia. And Bolivia fought a war against Paraguay over a region called the Gran Chaco, which is sort of this dry, almost desert-like region that didn't have a lot of people, but it had been disputed. So they went to war over it, and during the war, the army became very frustrated with the leadership of the country's president. So they launched a coup, and they replaced him with the vice president. Well, they didn't like him either. So they launched another coup after that and threw the vice president out. And this time, one of the officers behind the coup, a guy named Bosch, I think, installed himself as president and led the war effort from there. And eventually the war ended, Bolivia lost. And but Bosch stayed in power and tried to implement a set of reforms that he referred to as military socialism. And he couldn't get it done, basically. The politics in Bolivia were just so contentious and divisive that he couldn't get his agenda passed. So he declared himself dictator and just basically waved his hands and got rid of the legislature. So at that point, he didn't have all of these blocks and all of these issues getting his agenda done, but he still found it immensely difficult. In fact, he still wasn't able to get his agenda through because there was still so much resistance in broader society and even within his administration. And so after about a year of being dictator and 2 years in power in total, he finally just gave up and shot himself.
Oh.
Yeah. So that kind of speaks to the amount of difficulty, even in an authoritarian system, of getting your agenda through, getting politics, so to speak, done. Getting things done politically is just immensely difficult, especially when you have a lot of opposition. Mm-hmm. And again, the whole problem is just exacerbated by having a huge number of people to govern. Let's see. Have you traveled much? If so, do you have a philosophy for how to enable personal growth by leveraging traveling? I can honestly say that I have very rarely traveled, so no, I have not traveled much. I have a lot of interest in the rest of the world, but I don't have a lot of interest in interacting with people. I've always had a lot of social anxiety. I've gotten better with time, a lot better with time. It's manageable now, but I've never been one to kind of go out and do things. I'm always very insular and stay-at-home type person. So no, I can't say I've traveled much, and I can't then say how I would leverage traveling for personal growth. Although a lot of people have done that, so if you are interested in doing that, I would encourage you to kind of seek such information out. Unfortunately, you can't seek it out from me, but it were otherwise. But yeah, definitely don't give up on that. Traveling is generally a good way to learn about other cultures, it's a good way to practice social skills, and it's a good way to just kind of learn about the world in general and learn how to be self-sufficient, all of which are very valuable skills that I probably could do to learn at some point.
I've traveled quite a bit. The main piece of advice I would give to people who are either traveling or thinking about going on a trip is to embrace the differences from your home to the new place. A lot of people, they'll go on a trip and they'll try to shape the new place to be as close to home as possible, which I feel kind of defeats the purpose of immersing yourself in another place. So notice the different ways that the people act toward you compared to your home. Notice the difference in the food. Notice the difference in the infrastructure and the architecture, and kind of be curious and embrace all those different things. It can be really overwhelming if you just travel and then you're suddenly surprised by all these differences. So planning effectively, I think, is a good mitigating factor to being anxious or overwhelmed with a different place. There's also the cost of flying there and then figuring out where you're going to stay and paying for lodging and all that. But it can be a very enriching experience, I think, for people to dive into a different culture. The thing that was really surprising to me was if you're an American, from our kind of personal perspective, and you go to Europe, the culture is fairly similar. A lot of the behavior and stuff of the people is fairly similar. There are some differences, and it's really fun to learn about those differences. But you can go to, say, an Arabic country, and it is drastically different. And it's beautiful in very different ways, just how different people stand and walk and talk to each other, and the different ways the roads look. So traveling is almost universally an experience which will enrich you, as long as you're not obviously in danger in some capacity.
Yeah, do be safe.
Yeah. They actually post some travel advisories. I saw a map subreddit post recently of a world map of the Eastern Hemisphere and different countries colored for either do not visit here or exercise more caution or that kind of thing. Pretty fun. Be careful. Have fun and be careful.
Yeah, there's a lot of resources out there if you are interested in traveling that can kind of, for one, kind of inform you as to any risks there may be, but also in terms of what you can expect, how much it's going to cost, which areas you should go to, which areas you should not go to. I mean, and a lot of those are very good resources. I don't use them to learn about traveling. I use them to learn about the cultures themselves, because there's often a lot of good information and travelogue videos like that about the native cultures and how they do things, etc. There used to be a TV series called, I think it was Globe Trekker, and that was a very good series. It was mostly kind of geared towards people traveling, but a lot of the episodes dealt with the cultures, the history, etc. And so, I liked them a lot just for that. And, one of the cool things that's happened on YouTube over the past couple of years, because I don't think I remember seeing it as much before that, is that there's a whole lot of people with travelogues on YouTube now, and a whole lot of people talking about their experience and comparing their own culture with the host culture, and it's really interesting stuff. Again, for me, it's mostly interesting for the cultural comparison, but they also talk a lot about travel and etc. So I would encourage you to kind of look up some of that material as well, depending on where you want to go exactly. Dallas is perhaps not the best place to go for such things. We don't have a lot of amenities for backpackers like they do in Europe, so you might have a rough go of it here.
Yeah, another thing to use as an alternative too, if we want to think about expanding your experience. Some people do not have the budget to fly to a different continent and stay for months and backpack around and whatnot, but watching a documentary that's set in a country that you've never been to usually creates a really, really cool story of stuff that you did not even know was in the world. That's been a really refreshing way to kind of break away from the usual grind of what your neighborhood is complaining about and what your country's news is bitching about, and you just go somewhere totally different halfway around the world, and they don't know anything about your problems, you don't know anything about their problems, but those are all human problems, and they're real, and it can really kind of refresh your perspective on what's happening.
Yeah, there's no shortage out there.
Do you know what's happening in Liberia right now? Didn't think so. Go learn you.
What is happening in Liberia right now? New president, that's what it was. They had a female president, and her term went out. Term ended, basically, and she'd already served 2 in a row, and so now they have a new guy on, whom I think is a former soccer star? Well, you guys outside the U.S. don't call it soccer, do you? It's a football star. I think
they call our
new
football
president.
hand egg.
As well they should.
Technically it is. We award you 4 points. Good job.
Yeah, something else about traveling. I don't know if this is... Because the original question was focusing on personal growth, but I'm kind of thinking more about technical things. So I'll just add this as a kind of side note. Try to learn sort of the norms of behavior so that you don't accidentally piss people off, because that's very easy to do. One of the reasons that Americans think that French people are really rude is because a lot of Americans don't understand how to interact with waiters. So American tourists will go to France, and this is something that goes back like a long way, you know, half a century or more. American tourists will go to French restaurants, and you know, they're sort of used to kind of using hand signals and whatnot, trying to demand attention from waiters and whatnot, and that's not quite couth in France. You know, in France, you're expected to treat the waiter as an equal. He's more just a person who happens to be there who will help you, rather than somebody who's being paid to help you. He's not your servant like he is in America.
And if I can add on, this is also a person who does not really care about your personal life, because they have their own personal life to attend to. That's another key difference. I think the most important point that I've learned for people who go to France and they say, oh, French people are so rude. If you go to a place and you just walk up to someone and talk English to them, that's kind of annoying, because it's France, it's a French-speaking country, and making the assumption that they're going to adjust to what you want from the outset without even making an effort to speak the native language, you're going to have a bad time. So my experience was, I'm not a great fluent French speaker, but if I say, hello, how are you, I can't speak French as an opening, they think you're cute. They like that, because you respected their space as a French space, and then a lot of them can speak English, they'll just help you out, do whatever you need to do, and it's all great. So try French first, there's your tip.
Yeah, do try to make at least some minimal effort to fit in.
What is that, when in Rome?
When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Good advice 2,000 years ago, good advice now.
Yep.
I might add, Neuro made a point about budgets. I think that's something people in Europe don't often understand about the Americans. A lot of Americans really don't have the budget to travel very much. You know, for one, the rest of the world is across, across two oceans. That makes it a bit expensive. You know, in Europe, if you want to travel to another country, just walk a couple miles. You know, there's very small countries in Europe, so it's not hard to travel abroad, so to speak. But here in the US, it's much more difficult and much more expensive. And a lot of people, not having as much of a social safety net as in Europe, can't really afford to take as many liberties, so to speak, with their income. So that's one of the big reasons Americans are not as well traveled, which is something I know that Americans get a lot of criticism for. Of the Americans who do travel abroad, generally they are either more well off or they've been saving for that trip for a while, probably. It's not generally the average Joe who kind of goes backpacking through Europe or something.
There is quite a bit of landmass too, so a lot of American people, I feel, they save up some money and they just travel to a different part of the States. And they're like, oh, it counts. We traveled, yay. And it does, it's a long way. Drive across Texas, that's like driving across half of Europe. And I stayed in Texas the whole time.
Yeah, it's a big state. I think you and Kukio drove... What? You drove up to Vancouver? Is that what it was?
Yes, we drove from Dallas to Vancouver and back. We took different routes either time. Once going through the Rockies and once going directly west to California and then up. Both trips are really beautiful in different ways. Utah is a very beautiful state. And I think there's a really cool kind of awareness of how a landscape changes over time that you don't get to experience all the time, where it goes from being a certain way to gradually the next way. We have a lot of stereotypes for places, like Colorado is a mountain state. It kind of is. It's also West Kansas for a lot of it, which is very boring, and it's very flat, and there's not a lot going on. I didn't know that until I drove through Colorado, and I saw how boring the west side of it was. But people draw the lines for states and for countries, but the way that the landscape changes is a lot more gradual, is kind of the point there.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, so I'm sorry I couldn't more directly address the travel question. Not having traveled much, I can't really add a lot of commentary there. But I encourage you to kind of try, because that is, I know, one of the things that people often cite as having been very enriching. So it is conducive to personal growth in the way that you're probably trying to ask me about. Let's see, the next one was, the Gilded Age came about because a wave of industrialization raised productivity and wealth. The leaders of industrial empires engaged in a multitude of anti-competitive practices and rent-seeking behavior to capture a large fraction of that new wealth. Are we entering a second Gilded Age driven by the tech industry, with information substituted for railroads and oil? How might such a period end? Will antitrust legislation again be brought to bear against entities trying to achieve monopoly? Let's see. So there's a lot of question there. Are we entering a second Gilded Age? No, because I would argue we've already been in one. Probably this second Gilded Age started in the 1980s with financial reform in the United States, which kind of bled out into the rest of the Western world and led to a sort of neoliberal golden age, so to speak, of less regulation, well, deregulation basically, and open free markets, etc. All of the usual liberal economic management, new world order type stuff. So in that sense, yeah, we've already been in one for a while, and it's one of the reasons inequality has grown so much. There's been a lot of economic activity, and for better or worse, that's opened the door for some people to become immensely wealthy, either through endeavor or otherwise. So there's that, and then are we? I don't know if it's. I don't know if railroads and oil can be compared to information, though. And information works a bit differently. It's not quite a commodity in the same way that railroads and oil was. So I don't think it'll be. I think the tech industry is important as a principal driver of economic growth and as an important part of the economy, and one of the reasons that inequality has grown, because obviously tech companies and Silicon Valley, etc., that whole sector of the economy has kind of lent itself to the accumulation of massive amounts of wealth over a short period of time. The internet bubble sort of epitomized that from the late 90s into 2000, when the bubble burst. It wasn't hard to become immensely wealthy in that period. So I don't think information will quite substitute railroads and oil, because it doesn't. Information is a little too amorphous. It's a little too unwieldy as a commodity in the same way. You don't have to invade Latin America to secure your supply of information. So the political dynamics are just very different in that regard, and even as a economic entity, information behaves very differently. So it's an imperfect analogy in that regard. But the tech industry, though, like you say, I think that is a better analogy for the previous Gilded Age and the industries that were prominent at that time. Just not narrowly in the sense that they trade in information. The tech industry trades in lots of things beyond just information. There's also telecommunications, there's also social media, etc. I recognize that information is sort of part and parcel of social media, but they are to a degree separate businesses. You make money from social media partly through advertising, not just selling people's information. In that sense, social media is almost more like television, in a sense. Sort of just a new mode of communication. So then, how might such a period end? I mean, that's a tough call, because there's a lot. It can end any number of different ways. I mean, the structural drivers of the economy could change such that the tech industry isn't as important. The tech industry could mature in such a way that it no longer lends itself to the accumulation of massive wealth in a few people. It may kind of diversify and become defined more by a number of smaller firms rather than a few large firms. Anything can happen in the long term. We've talked about long term versus short term before, so it's difficult to make a prediction there. The last Gilded Age kind of ended partly because of a regulatory initiative on the part of Theodore Roosevelt as well as progressives in the United States. Also, World War I helped, and that led to a lot of new regulations, not all of which were unwound after the war ended. Ideally, there will not be another World War, so I don't think this current Gilded Age, such as it is, will end for that reason. But there could well be, as you point out in your question, a renewed push for antitrust legislation to try to break up large companies that may or may not be trying to monopolize their respective markets. That's going to depend on how the politics in individual countries sort of evolve. Here in the United States, the attitude is that these firms with monopolistic powers in the United States, specifically in the telecommunications industry and the tech industry, the attitude here is largely that these are natural monopolies and that they arose for legitimate reasons, not because they're uncompetitive. There is such a thing as a natural monopoly in which it's acceptable to be a monopoly. It's not considered in breach of antitrust legislation if your business is structured in a way that just kind of lends itself naturally to the emergence of a single firm or a few firms in the industry. But the attitude in Europe is different. The attitude in Europe is that certain tech firms like Google are using uncompetitive practices to ensure that their market share is protected and maintained. And so in Europe, there's more of a push for antitrust legislation, and that trend could gain steam in the future and lead to a much broader set of antitrust legislation that cracks down significantly more on large tech firms, which might result in more competition. But if the American perspective is more right, then it'll probably just result in the status quo being maintained, just with more taxes, basically for Google and other firms that have to face continuing continuing court action on the part of regulators trying to punish them for being monopolistic, for having monopolistic power in their respective markets.
You mentioned potential for another world war. I think a really important tool for people when they think about future events is not just, can this event happen, but how likely is this event to happen and why? So there's a theme in what we've talked about, the surprising decline in violence over time. And that is, as people's quality of life increases, their willingness and enthusiasm to risk their life in war reduces. So because you're happier to watch this awesome TV show that wins Oscars and have great food and be with your family and be safe, you're less keen to go to another country, get on a plane, and shoot people until you die. It sounds less alluring than if you're unemployed, you're unhappy, you're eating gross stuff all the time, and you really want some big change. We're more comfortable now than we are before, so why would we get off our ass and die for someone else right now? So that's kind of the main difference between World War I to World War II to now. We're actually in an era called the Long Peace, for how long we've been without that large-scale conflict and also the per capita risk to someone's life. It's true that we have lots of violence in the world still, and it's more reported on now than it ever was before, but per person, we're safer than ever. So the next World War, technically it is possible, but it is not super likely to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, we're kind of on a trend towards more state competition, great power competition, but it's still not very large, and the trend is not very steep. It's not like escalating very rapidly. There have been tensions in the international sphere, like between the United States and Russia, conflict in the Middle East, potential conflict between the United States and China. That's more like rivalry than competition. But so there are some building blocks there, but if you kind of break them down into their individual causes and motivations, etc., then it's not really that problematic. Like, there's really no reason for the United States and Russia, for example, to really be in competition. A lot of that is being driven by domestic political considerations in Russia and the United States, respectively. And sort of the outcome is this sort of weird competition in Ukraine. Not even competition, it's more of a circus. It's more of a horse and pony show. Like, it doesn't really mean that much. We've talked about the Ukraine before, and we can talk about it again if somebody is curious. I'm sure some people would have some strong opinions on that, and I would be happy to go into it, but the point is there's really not much reason for that to escalate any more than it has, and I don't think it will. If you look at the fundamental reasons for tension between Russia, they're not really that sustainable, and they'll probably be worked out in the long term when other distractions come up that are more useful than competition between those two respective countries. Middle East conflict is similar. Saudi-Iranian rivalry is kind of driving conflict in the Middle East, but neither one of them really wants open war. I mean, the Saudis have the ultimate trump card, which is the United States. The United States, being a superpower, if it wanted, could do a lot of damage to Iran, so that restricts Iranian ambition. But there's a limit to the degree to which the United States wants to be involved in Middle Eastern conflict, which is very sort of politically unpopular in the United States, always has been, but even more so after Iraq. So then there's a limit to Saudi ambition. So in a sense, there's a kind of equilibrium there. That doesn't mean there won't be a lot of violence and conflict as the rivalry works itself out and a new equilibrium in the region is reached in terms of the balance of power. But the prospect of it really escalating out of control is relatively unlikely, even in a place like Syria, where the United States and Russia are nominally toe-to-toe. And then China, you know, with the Communist Party of China, like what we were talking about before, they're a hell of a lot more concerned with trying to manage 1 billion plus people than they are dealing with the United States. You know, the United States is more of an irritant than a priority for the Communist Party of China. The principal goal is to assert party legitimacy and ensure continued party rule. That's the principal thing the party concerns itself with. Everything else is a sideshow. So, those are all just ways in which the current era of peace is to a degree threatened, but likely will not escalate into legitimate threats to continued peace. So that's kind of a meandering, all over the place answer to the Gilded Age question here, or set of questions.
Yeah, but that was fun. Let's be honest.
I hope I satisfyingly kind of addressed the question there. If not, you know, if I ever don't quite answer the question the way you want, anybody who asks questions, if I ever don't quite answer the questions to your satisfaction, do feel free to elaborate and kind of return to it, you know, ask again, and you know, I'm happy to kind of get back to it and have another go, so to speak. Let's see. Since you mentioned how difficult it is to govern people, especially a population as large as China's, what do you think of Xi Jinping's decision with the Communist Party to extend his term by removing term limits for the president? Yeah, that's kind of part of a secular trend in Chinese politics, where Xi Jinping kind of gets more and more power and tries to build the party more and more around him. That kind of is opposing evidence to what I said before about Xi Jinping building institutions in China. One of the weaknesses, institutional weaknesses in China, is a lack of rules regarding transition of power. You know, whichever clique or group of people is in power, how do you transition from them to a new group of leaders? And historically, the party has been really bad at that. You know, you can see the Mao era was a pretty big mess, and partly for that reason, just clashes of personalities. And then after that, there was a concerted effort by the party to try to implement some informal norms as far as who will succeed one group of people. And sort of the nominal agreement was that there would be a kind of alternating power, basically. There would, for one, term limits were implemented in the Constitution. I think that was done in the 80s. I might be wrong. But there was also agreement that one faction, basically sort of the Princeling / Shanghai faction, or whatever you want to call it, would be in power for 10 years, and then they would kind of hand that over to the Communist Party Youth League faction, which is sort of the people who are not as well connected, who kind of rose up the party ranks more on their own rather than because of who they knew or whose family they were born in. And then after 10 years of that, they would switch back to the other faction. Nominally, there's not supposed to be factions in China, and really, the way the factions there are line up, there's not actually really just two neatly delineated factions like I just described. There's actually a huge diversity of different factions that all kind of interlink with each other in complicated ways. So nominally, there is a kind of establishment, conservative, connected faction, and a Communist Party Youth League faction on the other side, but in practice it's not nearly as simple as that. That's just sort of a rough rule of thumb to use to kind of look at broader Chinese politics. So nominally it was agreed that there would be sort of alternating periods of 10-year periods of power in which one group would maintain power and then alternate to another. But Xi Jinping has broken that, and that's an example of not building up China's institutions. That's actually exacerbating a weakness. Nominally, I would still assert and argue that Xi Jinping has been trying to build up China's institutions broadly, especially institutions of state. But in terms of transition of power and managing, having more rule of law rather than rule of man, China has been backsliding on that count under Xi Jinping specifically. So it's not surprising then that Xi Jinping made this move. A lot of people had been predicting he would probably try it at some point. He'd already consolidated an immense amount of power in the previous Congress. So no great shock, but it's indicative of the direction that China's going. It's moving more in a dictatorial direction, basically. You know, Xi Jinping is setting himself up for the long term to stick around as the leader of China. And you know, whether that's for the best, whether he has the best of intentions, or whether he's just doing it for his own personal enrichment, or whether it's something in between, nobody's quite sure yet, because nobody really quite knows what's in his head, or just what kind of agenda he has in mind, once he really has his claws on China, so to speak, once he really has full power.
It's one of the themes that comes up a lot in fiction and storytelling, which is if you have a very powerful leader, you have the potential for very fast change. So if you have a really good leader, you could enact a lot of good changes faster than a very kind of bickering legislature could. But you also put yourself at risk for a bad leader who can make things really bad really fast because they have so much power.
Mm-hmm.
So usually you try to strike a middle path. Like in the US, we have 3 branches with checks and balances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that slows things down considerably, as we've seen, but it also mitigates the amount of damage that any one political actor can do in the short term, which a lot of people are thankful for, and have been over the course of American history. There have been a number of presidents that people haven't liked. There's been a number of Congresses that people have really not liked. And having that difficult system in place that makes governance difficult has served to limit the worst impulses of the powerful in the United States. It's also served to protect. Rather unpalatable status quos, such as they are, or statuses quo, I should say. And that's been very difficult to unwind itself. But in general, things move in the right direction and things get done over the long term. In China, things might improve dramatically, as Neuro just described, under Xi Jinping, but then there's the question of, okay, what happens after Xi Jinping? He's not going to live forever. And that could get very, very messy. Let's see. As someone who pays much more attention to world news than the average person, do you have any advice for how to sort through information? I can flip through BBC and New York Times all I want, but it's still a massive deluge. Well, you know, generally, as someone who's kind of been watching it for a long time, you can kind of pick up on trends and narratives, etc., or just things that you personally are interested in, and those are kind of the things that catch your eye more. So if you're looking for more of a streamlined experience rather than trying to swallow the entire world's worth of news, you can kind of focus in on individual issues. You know, when I started out as a kid, I really didn't know a lot about what was going on in the world. I was just really curious and wanted to learn. So probably if you're just starting out and you do want to get to a point where you're really familiar with world issues, just take in what you can. And don't overburden yourself. And as you get more knowledge of a given interest, that'll probably bleed into interest in other issues, because a lot of international issues interconnect with each other in a lot of different ways. So, you know, you may be interested in Syria, but then your interest in Syria may lead you to an interest in Russian politics, because Russian politics in part determine what happens in Syria. So then being interested in Russian politics, that might lead you to look into political systems. So then you're looking into political systems generally. So then when you watch the news, you start paying attention for things that have to do with politics or political systems generally, or Russian politics generally, etc. So start small and then just kind of spread slowly out. And then over time, you just kind of build up a depth and breadth of knowledge. That's sort of a...
Or you could subscribe to the Twitch channel and you get his weekly news collection once a week, which I feel might be more efficient. It depends on how much you want to do the digging yourself, because that's one of the things that makes you so fun to talk to, is you enjoy the process of really figuring out not just the cream of the crop, but like the majority of what's happening in the world. That's fun for you. And you have different types of activities and how much time you want to commit. If you could only commit 1 hour a week to read world news, the experience is not going to be the same as Agent Smith, right? So there are different shortcuts you can take depending on what type of information you want and what area of the world you want to focus on, that kind of thing. So we have a shortcut here for you from his hard work where he can be a filter.
Yeah, well, to be fair, not everything on there is always particularly illuminating. You know, some of the stuff is kind of meat and potatoes, 3-paragraph long articles saying this thing blew up in some place, which is, you know, useful knowledge if you're very interested in that specific country or locality, but not necessarily if you're interested in a particular issue or you're just looking for examples of authoritarian governance or some other such. So specialization is very helpful as far as sorting through information. You know, the likelihood that you're going to you know, master all things everywhere is unlikely. I don't do that, and I don't have any pretense to it, and I don't have much ambition to it. You know, I just, again, it's more fun for me. It's interesting, and I have particular issues that I tend to home in on. But I'm always on the lookout for more. But I'll never know all of them, and I'll never have a full, comprehensive understanding all of them. That's the downside of being a generalist. That's kind of my approach, to be more of a generalist in this.
What's up, gamers?
So I know a lot about a lot of things, but I don't know a lot about any one thing. That's the downside, and nobody really wants to pay somebody to know a little bit about a lot of things, unfortunately. But it were otherwise, that's kind of what I was told in grad school. I had this sort of mad delusion that I could specialize in both China and India, and I told that to my advisor, and he looked at me like I was insane. You can't do that. You can't do that. You have to. He was very polite. You know, generally advisors are very diplomatic, generally, and so he was more like, maybe you should think about narrowing that down a little bit. Like, oh, but I don't want to. I can't choose. I can't pick one, you know, that kind of attitude. So it is more manageable to specialize. And then if you want to branch out from there, you can, kind of at your own leisure and at your own time.
Did you know that India is an entire subcontinent and they both have 1 billion people each? Would you like to rethink your position here?
Let's see. You might try, this isn't a substitute for other news sources, but there's a website called Real Clear World. And it's a news aggregator, and they just kind of pick and choose different articles on different subjects with regard to international events. And it's not a complete summary of all the world's events. You know, I don't think anybody can do that. But they kind of hit the highlights, and they have some interesting discussions on there. And so I kind of lean on that somewhat as well. You know, I have the usual gamut of news sources, news sites, etc. But then if I have time, I'll kind of pop by Real Clear World and, you know, kind of see what I've missed, because there's inevitably a lot of stuff out there that you just don't have time for. So some of that can be very interesting. And that might be a good starting point. I hope I'm getting this question right. I'm kind of approaching it from different directions. So if that's if the answer has not been satisfyingly answered, no, and I'll take another crack at it. Let's see. If Facebook is determined to be an illegal monopoly that must be broken up, how do you see such a company breakup working that addresses the monopoly concerns while allowing the spun-off companies to stay economically viable? Ooh. That's very technical. I don't know that I know enough about the business model of Google to know how that would work. It would probably involve specifically their search business, their business as a search engine. So if Google were broken up in that way, I'm not entirely sure how that would work, or even if it could. Because I'm sure Google would argue tooth and nail that it's a natural monopoly and that they shouldn't be broken up like that. Hypothetically, it could be done. There is precedent. You know, there have been monopolies that have been broken up, like Standard Oil or like Ma Bell way back in the day. But I don't think it's never been done to a tech company like Google. And there may be some eccentricities to doing it with a technological company like Google that make its experience and make the practice of breaking it up different than the experience of breaking up previous examples of monopolies. So I would have trouble then predicting what it would look like exactly and how it would be done. And again, that's assuming you get to a point where the court rules against Google, which is a stretch at this point. There would probably have to be, for one, a new administration, and two, new legislation on antitrust in order for a shift like that to happen. If nothing else, you could just lay a lot of penalties on Google and basically force them to downsize in order to encourage competitors in the market. But that would be very much a bludgeon. I don't even know if that would even be legal, per se. So yeah, that's not a great answer. Basically, I don't know. But it would be a very interesting experiment, having never been done before. Yeah, with Ma Bell, they broke it up into, gosh, it must have been like half a dozen to a dozen different firms initially. And basically, they were just given different regions. It was kind of cut into different regional markets. And the different incarnations of Bell that it had been broken into competed with... For those who don't know, Ma Bell, that was a phone company in the United States, mid-20th century, and it monopolized, basically, the communications industry, you know, the phone industry. And the business was broken up according to regions, and then the different regional actors were able to compete with each other. So that was how they did it with Bell, if I'm remembering correctly. Please correct me if I'm getting that wrong. And over the long term, that didn't quite work out, because the different bits would consume each other, and eventually it turned into one giant conglomerate again. But when they initially broke it up, that's how they did it. But you can't really break something like Google into geographic markets, because, you know, the internet is basically just one giant amorphous global thing. So it would be difficult then to have that break the company up according to any kind of spatial element. To break it up into markets like that, you would have to do it in another way. And I don't know if there's really even an equivalent, which is why I'm skeptical that it could even be done. But it may be that people more familiar with the topic know a way to that would be able to do that. But I'm just not familiar enough with the business model to know how it could be done. Do you have any thoughts on the relevancy of Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, 25 years or so after its publication, and how it held up? I haven't read it, but I've read of it, and it has popped up a lot in my studies. When I was in grad school, anyway, a while ago. Nominally, the gist of the book was that in the future, competition in the world would not be ideological. It would come down to different cultures competing with each other. Frictions between cultures would create civilizational schisms that would result in civilizational conflict. And so the West, the Middle East, China, you know, all these different cultural regions, basically, there would eventually come to some degree of conflict over different visions of the world, different preferences as far as global governance, if not individual bilateral issues. There is some merit to that. I mean, obviously, cultural schisms have become an issue in a lot of places. But I still don't think in general, I'm skeptical about the assertion that culture and that there will be basically civilizational conflict going forward. I suspect it's going to be a lot more fluid than that. And breaking down problems in individual countries, it almost always comes down to domestic political considerations or some economic shift of some kind. There's always something going on that's driving discontent in a country, and those factors are generally more important to kind of drawing a read on international conflict, since international conflict generally starts as some kind of domestic conflict at some point in time. So I'm a little skeptical of just sort of reducing all conflict and tension down to just cultural issues. There are a lot of other factors at play there that are as important and probably more important than just culture. So judging how well it's held up is a subjective exercise, so that kind of makes the question a little difficult to answer. To what degree is culture responsible for current international tensions? Well, it's kind of a matter of interpretation. I mean, hypothetically, you could interpret all of it as just coming down to culture. The Russians have a culture that is more authoritarian and a little less democratic, so that creates natural cultural tension with the more politically open West, and so maybe that's why the Ukraine is an issue and why Syria is an issue. Maybe the terrorism comes down to Islamism and its influence on Middle Eastern culture, so maybe that's the reason for that tension between Europe and the Middle East. It's you can make the argument. My counter-argument is just that it's reductive. Too reductive, rather. It's just you're kind of forcing all of these different issues looking into one frame, rather than kind of trying to look at the broader factors that influence them. I'm not saying culture is not a factor at all, just that there's a lot of different factors, and that the perspective in this book is kind of narrowly emphasizes one over all of the others. So in that sense, I'm critical, but of course it's open to interpretation and subjective. So kind of make of that what you will. Let's see. Do you think it's possible for men and women to work together without friction and things like sexual harassment, given how new the current mixed-gender work environments are in the society? As an example, makeup causes tension as well as high heels, even as a symbol of empowerment. Doesn't make sense for such barriers to be removed.
That sounds like a Packed Facts question.
That's definitely a Packed Facts question. but it were so that she were here. Cast a summoning spell or some such.
Yeah. If I could unpack a little bit of it, you could think
Sure.
about the energy required to leverage sexual harassment. That costs energy for an agent to harass someone. Just as in StarCraft, for someone to harass the opponent's base, it costs energy and effort. So I think to request an action to cease and desist is less unrealistic than expecting people to now behave in different ways. That requires more concentrated effort of, okay, now I need to direct myself in a certain way. Whereas what they're asking for here is, as there are more women in the workplace, please do not sexually harass them. The maximum lazy approach is to sit down and do nothing. So, from my personal perspective, it doesn't seem ridiculous to say, okay, we could just not harass people by, for one, being lazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not the best person to ask this in a number of ways. For one, gender politics and gender issues are not really my bag. It's not something I've studied a lot. More to the point, I don't even have a lot of personal experience with this, because most of my experience has been working as a research assistant in grad school. I was in college for a very long time. I pretty much jumped from undergrad right into grad. So I don't have a lot of experience. Working in a private sector workplace dealing with these kinds of issues. More to the point, I've always been, as I said before, very socially anxious, so I haven't really talked very much with people in general. So my general approach to talking with people has just been not to do it, and so I haven't really had to worry about things like sexual harassment or whatnot. So it's kind of hard for me to draw on my own experience in that regard. I don't have a lot to add there.
To give a friendly jab, it's hard to sexually harass someone in the workplace if you don't go to the workplace.
Yeah, that's putting it diplomatically. Yeah, that's very accurate. Yeah, I think part of the problem for people here is ambiguity. I don't know that a lot of people really have a problem with like actually ending harassment or hard harassment. And from what I've read, the criticism is more, what if this power is abused? What if there is ambiguity as to what constitutes sexual harassment? And what if that ambiguity is exploited by people to exert undue pressure or influence on others? I don't have an easy solution for that or an answer. Again, I haven't studied this enough to really have an answer, but that's the criticism I've read of that. I don't think that removing barriers like makeup or high heels or other sources of tension addresses that. I don't think it reduces the tension, because obviously that creates issues of, questions of personal liberty, what is appropriate, what's not appropriate. There's a lot of issues to unpack there as far as that particular proposal. And part of that comes down to whose impetus is it on in society to control for sexual tension. This goes beyond the workplace. I mean, historically it's been on women to try to control their own sexuality, sort of in deference to men, to make it to let men kind of have their sexuality hanging out, so to speak, and contain their own. And that was sort of the status quo for a long time. And we're sort of shifting more towards a model that's either more equitable or reverses the roles, so to speak, depending on your perspective. So how you read that depends on your personal politics, and I'm not going to get into that. Again, not well prepared for such a debate myself. But that is kind of the overarching issue. How do you manage sexuality between the genders when they're in, especially when they're in close proximity, like in a workplace? And obviously the status quo solution was not sustainable or particularly fair, but it's not really clear that there's any readily available replacement as of yet that is acceptable to all players involved.
One thing that I would recommend to help people if they feel kind of lost in the woods of, well, I don't know what all these different words mean, what do I do? For one, you can start from the perspective of respecting people, their space, and their wishes. And another key step would be if someone asks you to stop doing something, you should stop doing that thing. If you do those as a starting point, I think you'll be mostly alright.
Yeah, personal respect is always a good place to start.
Yeah.
And it's a good rule of thumb in general in all circumstances. Mm-hmm. So I would certainly highly encourage people to practice that as much as possible. As the old saying goes, treat others as you would have them treat you.
Unless you get into some people with some very weird interests, in which case it's not perfect. The golden rule is a good starting point, but it's not a perfect principle for how to live your life.
Fair point.
But it's worse, or it's better than being an asshole, we could say. There you go.
Yeah, being an asshole is one of the lesser rules of thumb. I would not encourage the use of that. There's no shortage in the world that doesn't need one more. Let's see. So I can't really answer that question particularly well, so I apologize. That's what I have on that. I don't have any good solution, so to speak, there, but Neuro's advice, just being respectful is probably the best way to go. And that really shouldn't be a stretch for most people. I think most people are still raised to be respectful. I don't think society has crumbled quite that much yet. So reinforcing that norm would be enormously helpful in and of itself. So there you go. Let's go with that for now. Mm-hmm. What are your primary sources of information? Any particular news sites you frequent daily? Probably the number one go-to is just BBC World News. I mean, they have world coverage, which is more than you can say for most news sources, and they do a relatively good job of being unbiased. I know some of the British listeners won't like that, because a lot of British people have issues with the BBC, but keep in mind, compared to the competition, BBC World News does relatively well. So given that, and if you're interested in world events, BBC is kind of a good go-to for that, just in terms of understanding just what's going on, what are the daily events happening. I mentioned Real Clear World before. That's pretty decent. That's not going to give you a comprehensive look at everything that's going on, but it has some interesting op-eds and some opinion pieces. what have you. Just interesting information. Kind of some of the articles on there take a deeper look at individual issues. So in that sense, it's useful. Yeah, I've got a whole list of things. Let's see if I can. The Diplomat is good for the Asia Pacific. The Economist is generally pretty good for looking at things more in depth. It just doesn't have as much scope. You know, they don't cover as much of the world. Well, they don't cover everything, basically. It's just they dedicate more time and analysis to understanding what few things they do cover. I highly recommend the Christian Science Monitor. I've always really liked their coverage. They kind of have the same problem in that they don't have the resources to cover everything, but they generally do a good job with. So I would certainly encourage people to look them up. Geez, who else? New York Times and Washington Post are good just for basic coverage, and those are used by political and economic elites a lot to kind of communicate. So it's useful just to kind of keep track of what's going on there in terms of top-level politics, movements, etc. It's been called the Journal of Record by a diplomat that I talked to once. So whether you like it, if you don't like it, or if you do like it, is kind of irrelevant to the fact that it is kind of an important source of discourse globally. And in that sense, it's important to follow what's being said there, just that you can kind of understand where the global debates are, what the issues are. Foreign Affairs is awesome, but I don't read it a whole lot. For one, because they don't publish that much, but also because the stuff they publish is very in-depth. And because I tend to kind of machine gun through a lot of different things, trying to get as comprehensive a view of world politics as I can. Generally, I don't always have time for it, but I try to make time for it, and when I do, I'm always glad I do, because their stuff is among the best in analysis. And they generally get really good writers to contribute too. So I would highly recommend Foreign Affairs. That's probably the only one that I actually go out of my way to spend money on for a subscription. Foreignpolicy.com is pretty good for foreign policy stuff. They generally do a pretty good job with inviting people of different viewpoints on to kind of give a broad spectrum, although they do tend towards a particular bias. But they have alternative viewpoints there, and generally they have good analytical stuff in terms of foreign policy type events and issues. Der Spiegel generally does pretty good stuff. I mean, there's no one place I go to. I generally, jump skip around depending on what's out there. But BBC I generally hit every day. Sometimes Real Clear World, and those are probably the ones I most consistently hit. And if I'm interested in doing deeper analysis in terms for a given issue, then I'll kind of Google around or maybe go to a think tank. Think tanks generally produce pretty good, generally the best analytical stuff comes from think tanks. And in fact, if you read a lot of articles, you notice that a lot of the articles are actually basically just describing something that was produced by a think tank. A lot of news is driven by press releases by governments and also by research done by various institutions, including think tanks. So if you pay attention to think tanks, you're kind of going directly to the source of a lot of news stories. And that can save you some time. But the trouble with think tank reports is that they tend to be very involved. Think tank reports are very analytical and very technical, generally. Not always, but generally the good ones are. So if you're interested in a particular issue that you read about in the news and you want to go really in depth, I would recommend going the think tank route. And there's a whole bunch of those. That's a whole another list I have. But anyway, that's roughly the gist of it. Al Jazeera, there's also lots of individual news services that cover particular regions well. Like Al Jazeera generally does the Middle East the best. You may or may not like the bent of their coverage, but it can't be denied that they have the most coverage of the Middle East, and they generally go the most in depth. They also have pretty decent documentaries over at Al Jazeera.
You've also talked about the difference between Al Jazeera Arabic and Al Jazeera English.
Yeah.
There are different teams of people, and the Arabic version, I think, has more propaganda kind of packed into it than the English one, which is more kind of a BBC. It attempts to be more neutral.
Yeah. Yeah, Al Jazeera English got its start by buying off a lot of established investigators and journalists from Western agencies like the BBC. And they basically just gave them free rein to run Al Jazeera English how they wanted, and so they made a pretty decent news service out of it. But, it's kind of waxed and waned with time since then, but initially that's how they got their reputation, as being decent news service. But Al Jazeera Arabic, in contrast, is like Fox News Middle East. You know, that's a very different affair. Not that Fox News is an entirely biased outlet, but it has a reputation for being a biased outlet. So in a similar way, Al Jazeera Arabic has a reputation for being a biased outlet in the Middle East. So do be wary of that if you do speak Arabic and go to Al Jazeera for your that is being produced from a particular bias, and they generally push that bias more in the Arabic service than they do in the English equivalent. They're actually two different agencies. They're not run as part of the same service. You know, CNN or BBC has one news agency, and then they publish their stuff in different languages. Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic are actually two different organizations that are run differently. They have some overlap, but for the most part, they're run independent of each other. Let's see, are there ways to measure corruption in government? At what point does, for example, a legislature change from being functional with some corruption to being essentially corrupt? Yeah, that's tricky. Because corruption is generally hidden. It's not something that's kind of out in the open, and that makes it hard to create metrics with which to measure it. Generally, when you measure corruption in a government, you use something like a... oh hell, I'm blanking out on the word. Not a quota, but a quotient. Let's put it like, that's not quite the word, but basically you created an index. Yes, I think that's it. You create an artificial index that incorporates different variables, and then you use those variables to construct an index rating for the country, and that allows you to rank countries. The index number itself for a given country doesn't really mean anything. It's just a rough measure of all the different variables that you think are important. I'm trying to remember. There is a particular NGO that has a corruption rating like that. That's well known, and I don't remember what it was. I haven't used it. I've done more research on the economic side of things, so I'm more familiar with the Index of Economic Freedom, which is constructed by, I think, the Friedman Institute, if I'm remembering correctly. Probably not. But that's an example of the type of index that you would construct for corruption. And as to the variables that go into that, you know, even that is kind of fraught, because it's hard to kind of get to the meat of the matter. I'm struggling to even really remember what the details were, because I'm not a big corruption guy. I haven't studied corruption specifically. Everything has its own field. I mean, democratic institutions, institutional failure, corruption, all of those are like individual fields with their own bodies of literature. There's a lot of reading you want to do if you want to get like a broad understanding of political science. So there's a lot of individual topics I'm not as familiar with. Corruption, what goes into that? I knew a guy in grad school who did corruption, and he was more of it. He was a experimental economist. And you know, the things he looked at was more modeling corruption, which involved trying to understand the incentive structure. You know, why are people corrupt? Why would you want to be corrupt? Why, if you don't want to be corrupt, why would you end up being corrupt anyway? You know, how does the structure of government lend itself to those various outcomes? Let me think for a minute and try to remember some specific variables there. So part of it is counting. You can do counts in which you go into news archives and you just count incidents of corruption, individual cases, or tallying the amount of money that was embezzled or otherwise stolen, misused, etc. And so you can create a count variable that measures the incidence of corrupt cases that move through the court system. Now that, of course, is not a perfect variable because it assumes that you have an independent judiciary that will investigate corruption and that is immune, for the most part, to bribery and coercion. That's not always the case, so a count isn't always great. Especially if you're trying to compare two different countries, that's a whole other layer of complication. Yeah, part of it is not so much measuring corruption, but looking for signs of corruption. There are sort of rules of thumb, like things you see. Like if you have a political system where somebody removes term limits, that's generally a red flag. If you see people being appointed to positions of power who are cronies, who have no particular expertise beyond being loyal to a particular political party or political leader, that's a red flag. So measuring corruption is not so much about a specific metric, it's more about looking for signs of corruption that are generally associated with corrupt political systems. And I'm sure somebody has some metrics out there, but I'm not familiar enough with the field to know them, to be familiar with them. And so I apologize on that count. I'm not quite giving you a satisfying answer in that regard. But my understanding is that's more how it's done. It's more done on a case-by-case basis. It's more of a qualitative approach to analysis rather than a quantitative approach to analysis. So in that sense, there's no real specific point at which a legislature shifts from being functional with some corruption to being more corrupt. There is a spectrum there, but because it's underground, because it's opaque, you can't really see it and measure it, and so that makes it difficult to mark a point by which that happens. Historically speaking, you have the benefit of hindsight, and so you can retroactively look back and see, oh, okay, this regime was really the mark of an increased level of corruption in this society and political system. But that's not very useful in the present, because in the present you don't have hindsight. You just have to operate with the information you have. And like I just explained, it's very hard to kind of mark specific degrees of corruption with the amount of information that's available in the present.
So we need corruption units, and we need a corruption detector that can detect these units.
Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, we do not have said detective units as of yet. Not quite there yet.
Disappointing. That would have made it so simple, though.
It would have. Yeah, I know they're working on like tiny drones. The military has been working on a bug drone that's the size of a fly. It's supposed to let them spy on people. So maybe someday, if you can have a whole armada of those flying around spying on politicians, then you would be able to root up corruption more thoroughly. Of course, then you would have the problem of temptation on the part of whoever's operating the drones to use them to blackmail the politicians, and that could introduce a vector of corruption rather than taking one away as intended. So there's a problem even there. Mm-hmm. Corruption is a thorny problem. It's not something that you can easily fix. It's more of a cultural norm problem. You know, you kind of need to have political norms in place and cultural norms in place that lend themselves to people not wanting to be corrupt and resisting the temptation to be corrupt. That's kind of the secret sauce of good governance. And that's not something that's easy to artificially induce. You know, it's something that kind of organically arises over time through the interaction of political development with economic development with corresponding social evolution. You could try to force it. I think probably more societies that have it have forced it than those who have had it grow organically. But even in the cases where it's been forced, the organic element ended up being the more important. Like in Germany's case, in Prussia's case, Frederick the Great is kind of the ultimate case study in building modern institutions, modern bureaucracies especially, and in enforcing bureaucratic professionalism, a sense of professionalism that resists corruption, that focuses on producing quality work and being dedicated to your job, and not being sidelined by little temptations. And Frederick the Great just did that through sheer, force, basically. Very strict rules, punishing people severely for trespasses, training, lots of training and education, such that people were as professional and had as much expertise as possible in those positions specifically. So Frederick the Great did it through that mode. But over the long term, those norms sort of spread from the bureaucracy he's building into wider society. And then over time, it became more of an organic part of German culture. Now, I'm not an expert on German history, so I might be getting some of that wrong. That's more from what I read from a Neuro study about institutional evolution and theories of how institutions arose in the West. So there might be some holes in that, so it's not a big picture look at German history and that individual case study. But that is one way to do it. That's kind of one way to ensure people are not corrupt, to build those norms that are resistant to corruption. In places like Britain, it was not forced so much, and just arose more naturally through the private sector, corporations, and then through the natural sort of political culture. The political culture in Britain was always more decentralized, and so lent itself to resistance to corruption, because being in the bureaucracy was kind of a privileged position. All of these different nobles and leading figures were entrusting you to look after their taxes and not waste them in government. So there was more a sense there that you had a responsibility to them, not to stab them in the back. Also, if you did stab them in the back, they would probably kill you. That probably helped too.
We'll stab you back.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to study is more institutional development in Britain, in societies that did more organically develop those kinds of institutions, because I'm more familiar with the case of like Prussia and other equivalent societies. But again, haven't done that yet, so I can't quite comment on it. So that's kind of a rough answer to the corruption question here. There's not really a good way to measure corruption, and so there's not really a good way to point out a specific point at which given political systems sort of cross the Rubicon of corruption, so to speak. Rubicon. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong.
We need the norms of corruption to be more and more ridiculous. Kind of like violence, where having a duel with pistols to a current person is ridiculous. We need corruption across the board to be seen as a ridiculous option that you wouldn't even choose, because it's absurd.
Yeah, one of the that kind of ties into one of the proposed anecdotes for corruption, which is paying bureaucrats more. If you increase their pay, that they don't have as much incentive, they don't have as much need, basically, for the extra income that comes from being corrupt. But even there, the problem is that if there is a culture of corruption, it wouldn't matter. I mean, if you can have higher pay and the income from being corrupt, why not? So with that culture of corruption in place, it's hard to resist that. So even there, it's not a perfect solution.
Sweet. Well, I've been on for a good 8 hours. It's been awesome having you back on, Sir Agent Smith.
Oh, did we blow through the time already?
We did.
Wow.
We had a Sea of Whiskey working on the questions this time, which is a first time for Sea of Whiskey. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sea of Whiskey. Much appreciated.
And we should be good to go for the next week as well. I had a bunch of festivities this weekend, so we do have a little bit less time today as opposed to some other Sundays, just because I've been out and about and doing all that. But we should be mostly calmed down now for now. But thanks so much for coming on. This will be on YouTube. Notice his Twitter link is in the chat. Give him a follow. He posts a lot of these links and then gives a little bit of commentary on Twitter on a regular basis. So if you want a little bite-sized information across the week, that's where you can go for that. But on that note, thank you very much, and we will see you on the next times. Agent Smith.
Yep, thanks again. Have a good night.
Nice. Bless Sea of Whiskey. Thank you very much for your time.